all great things must come to an end. And so it is that the pop culture phenomenon that changed the entertainment landscape forever begins its final instalment. Sorry, are we talking about the films or my reviews? Oh, okay. Disappointing. Star Wars had come and gone to great fanfare. The Empire Strikes Back had left fans on the edge of their seats wondering how the Rebel Alliance would turn around the events of that film. Now all that remained was for George Lucas to finish off the greatest science fiction trilogy ever. That happened on the 25th of May 1983, when The Return of the Jedi opened in American cinemas. Predictably, records fell. It had the largest opening weekend and week ever, and was by far the biggest grossing film in the world that year. Naturally, a lot of that was down to the fans' excitement at seeing the final part of the story, but it was also backed by a massive marketing campaign, one which included, as was tradition by now, a comic book adaptation from Marvel. This time, however, things would be a little bit different. Marvel's Star Wars series began with an adaptation of the original film. As they had with the likes of The Planet of the Apes and Logan's Run, once the film adaptation came to an end, they continued the series with original stories. Unlike those other two series, this one proved so popular that it ran and ran. 3 years after its launch, when The Empire Strikes Back was released, that too got an adaptation in the Star Wars comic, running from issue 39 to 44. The adaptation of The Return of the Jedi, though, would not feature in that comic. Instead, it would get its own limited series, a format that Marvel had only begun to use the previous year. Apparently the reason for this was so that the Star Wars title did not have to time its storylines to fit in with the adaptation. It also had the added benefit of giving Marvel 2 in-demand Star Wars titles a month for 4 months in a row. Oh yes, that was the other difference. The previous 2 adaptations had both lasted 6 issues, this was just 4. The series began a week after the film's release on the 31st of May, the same day that we received a collected edition in Marvel Super Special issue 27. Not only that, but as with the Empire Strikes Back adaptation, we also got a collected paperback edition, this time released by Piccolo Books, with a cover by Marie Severin. We are used by now to the tight secrecy surrounding Star Wars projects, and it was no different in 1983. In fact, some preview panels shown in issue 4 of Marvel Age had to have their word balloons blanked out, even though they were from the opening scene. I mean, can they be considered spoilers if they're from the very first scene? Scripter Archie Goodwin was, of course, amongst the select few who had access to the film's details. But even the editor of the adaptations, Joe Duffy, wasn't allowed to know what the films had in store for us until a few months before the comics were released. Even then, it was because she was also a writer on the main Star Wars title, and she had written an upcoming Star Wars story that contained a few elements that were too similar to events in the film. The covers for the series were by Bill Sienkiewicz, and although the team behind Marvel Age could see them, they weren't allowed to reproduce them for public consumption. So we know that the writer of the series was Archie Goodwin, and that Bill Sienkiewicz provided not only the covers for the series, but also that beautifully painted cover for the Super Special. We even know who the editor was, a role that I don't normally name check. But what about the interior art? Great news, it was provided by the brilliant Al Williamson, the same man who brought us the Empire Strikes Back adaptation. Which leaves only the colourist to talk about. If you've seen my Empire Strikes Back review, you will know that the Arrow Books version of that adaptation had a different colourist to the other versions. Well, that is true again this time around. And as before, it does have an effect on the storytelling, and shows me, someone that had never thought about it before, how important the colourist's role is. For most versions, the role was performed by Christy Scheel and Bob Sharon, but for Piccolo Books, the duty was given to Ken Fedunovich. Apologies to him for the likely mispronunciation of his name. Right, now I'm pretty sure there's nobody else left to discuss, so let's go one final time to that distant galaxy. Interestingly, all 3 versions present their opening credits differently. The Super Special has just a single page of text. The paperback has a 3-page build-up. But it's this, the series version, that I think wins, because we have not only the written credits, but some extra artwork by Bill Sienkiewicz. After that, all three versions present a one-page interpretation of the opening crawl before we join Darth Vader on the new Death Star. That's odd. I could have sworn that this adaptation began with R2-D2 and C-3PO on Tatooine. Okay, never mind. But already, straight away, we see those panels that were blocked out, that were censored in Marvel Age. And it's that discussion between Vader and Commander Jerjerrod, who gets more of a name check in the comic than he ever did in the film, about the progress of work on the Death Star. We are told that the Emperor is going to make an appearance, but I'm still not convinced that previewing the opening scene of any film can be considered a spoiler. Regardless, that brief scene is quickly over, and we head, there you go, to Tatooine. At this point, the book version gives us a lot more sky, but really there are no significant differences between the versions at the moment, just some changes in colouring choices. We already know how good Al Williamson is as an artist, but his rendition of C-3PO really is so impressive. As we see it now, as he and his shorter droid companion approach Jabba's palace. Once inside the palace, the droids manage to get an audience with Jabba, and here we get our first big difference between these three versions. As with the Empire Strikes Back adaptation, the series needs extra pages, and here we get the first one. It's always nice having something extra, but it's interesting because although there is writing on this page, it doesn't really add anything to the story. The other versions don't feel like they're missing anything at all. At this point, R2 plays the holographic message from his master, Luke Skywalker. And it's a hologram that's rendered slightly differently in the book's version. It looks ever so slightly more solid. Of course, C-3PO is unhappy with the message's contents. He says, "This can't be. R2, you've played the wrong message." Now, I've said before that I was a bit of a thick child, and there's a bit more evidence for that here, unfortunately. Because when I saw this film as a child, and C-3PO said, "R2, you've played the wrong message," I genuinely thought that R2-D2 had made a mistake and played one of a couple of messages. Anyway, next we have some interesting dialogue from Bib Fortuna. As he says, "Bargain rather than fight. This Skywalker is not a Jedi, Master." The reason that's interesting, even though it is pretty much what he says in the film, is because even now I can't understand him in the film. So it's nice to actually know for once what was being said. It's in Jabba's palace that we begin to see the differences in the colouring techniques. In most versions, the colours are more natural, even though the colours are stronger in the super special version. But the book, crikey! And it doesn't get any more subtle throughout this sequence of the dancer being dropped down into the Rancor pit. I don't mean to be rude, but it's as though the colouring decisions were made by a child. The worst example is probably this image of Lando Calrissian. In the comic book, yes, we've got the nice, natural muted colours, but in the paperback, again, not only do we have a kaleidoscope on the page, but the decision to effectively put Lando in the shadow and put more colour into this background character means that suddenly becomes the focus. I didn't even notice it in the other version, which is surely how it's supposed to be. He's the background character, not Lando. But back to the story. So both droids now have jobs working for Jabba, and after the Rancor has been fed, two more of our heroes arrive. As Leia, disguised as Boushh the bounty hunter, brings Chewbacca before the mighty hut. That Boushh outfit really was so cool, wasn't it? As you know, she manages to convince Jabba that she is legit. Chewbacca is led away, and that night she's able to put the next stage of the rebels' plan into action. Although she succeeds in freeing Han from the carbonite, she doesn't free him from the clutches of Jabba. In fact, she ends up joining him as a thrall of Jabba. One positive aspect is that at least Han has now been reunited with Chewbacca. Now tell me something. If this is some kind of mist, then what's that? Colour makes all the difference, doesn't it? Finally, Luke arrives, and having easily got past the guards and the weak-minded Bib Fortuna, he urges Jabba to release his friends. Jabba naturally has no interest in this, and after a classic image from the film, Luke falls to face a big challenge. After overcoming the Rancor in a nice little action sequence, Luke too is now a prisoner of Jabba. And before you know it, Jabba's sail barge and a skiff travel out across the Dune Sea, where Luke, Han and Chewbacca will all face the horrors of the Sarlacc. A relatively short chapter in the story, padded out not only with that earlier extra page of artwork, but at the end of the issue we have these extra 4 bonus pin-ups, just to pad things out a little. So the battle with the Sarlacc is actually seen in issue 2, after we've had that initial extra page showing the credits and an additional bit of artwork, where we rejoin our heroes. And these next few pages really are great. We've got interesting, exotic things to look at, and once R2-D2 has fired Luke's lightsaber to him, we get plenty of action too. And you will of course note that the Sarlacc doesn't have a beak. Leia kills Jabba, and once he is dead, she reaches desperately for a gun with which to free herself from the chain, but it's a gun that is tantalisingly out of reach. Instead, she is discovered. Does she do that in the film? Almost. You actually see her look ever so briefly in the direction of the gun before the camera cuts away. So quickly you wouldn't even know that there was a gun there. There is page after page of action as Luke cuts his way through Jabba's minions. And Boba Fett, who is looking as cool as ever, actually gets a line. After he lands on the skiff and gets Luke lined up in his sights, Han swings his spear at him. And Boba Fett says, "You interfering blind gawk, you're next." Okay, so it's not much of a line, but it's more than he gets in the film. After Fett exits via the Sarlacc, Chewie tells Han of his fate, and Han says, "I did that. Wish I could have seen it." We then get all the main beats from the film, such as R2 cutting Leia free, C-3PO being teased by Salacious Crumb before he is also dealt with by R2, Luke's mechanical hand being exposed, Lando's struggles to break free of the Sarlacc. It's all there, including Leia taking out a gunner who is surely in the wrong film. He looks like he should be on the Russian front during the Second World War. In the film, we don't quite get this. We see Leia approaching the gunner, and then the next thing we see after having a quick look at Luke is that she's in control of the gun. Her next move, of course, is to aim the gun at the deck of the sail barge. C-3PO and R2 dive over the side, and we get another extra page of art in this version. Okay, it's exciting, but that can't be Al Williamson. But it is unquestionably Al Williamson who brings this scene to an end, as Lando is finally pulled free, and Luke and Leia recreate their famous swing from the first film and the first Death Star. And we even get a bit of additional dialogue, as after Luke apologises to the rest of the crew for things getting messy, Han says he's thinking a lot about this whole situation, because being frozen in carbonite was pretty close to being dead, and now it isn't just his eyes that are seeing things differently. As for Jabba's sail barge, okay, yeah, it's on fire, but I've seen worse. But in the book, it's an inferno. Finally, the Emperor arrives on the Death Star, but it's clear that something strange is going on, because in all the images of him having his chit-chat with Darth Vader, we never once see an Imperial Guard. Plenty of everyone's favourite Star Wars figure, the Imperial Dignitary, but no guard. And it's not just in this chapter. Throughout the entire adaptation, you will never see an Imperial Guard. In the adaptation of The Empire Strikes Back, they didn't show the space slug, although we saw the Millennium Falcon inside it. And that's because they wanted to hold something back for the audience when they went to the cinema, so they didn't know everything that they were going to see. I can only assume that is behind the decision in this to hide the incredibly cool Imperial Guards. Otherwise, where are they? We have some great looking flora on Dagobah, which is served well both by the muted colours of the series and the more vibrant colours of the magazine. Not so much the book. Luke's visit to Yoda is pretty much as we know it. There are a couple of minor changes to dialogue, but nothing significant. And then at the end, Luke leaves Yoda to much needed rest. And there was me thinking that he died. Well, not in this, he doesn't. He doesn't die, he doesn't fade from existence. I guess that's something else that they wanted to hold back for the film. Instead, we are just told that he goes off to have some much needed rest. Now this bit, I know I say this a few times, but this bit is interesting because Obi-Wan is back and each one of these three versions presents him in a very different way. In the series, he is pale and appropriately ghost-like, although that does mean that at times he isn't very clearly made out. In the book, Ken Fednovich takes his usual random approach to the colours, but in the Super Special, it isn't just the colours that have changed. They've added something as well. Even though the pale colours from the series would have shown up better in this edition, they have gone for giving him full colour, plus a little sparkly aura. Now, I'm going to assume that the pale version in the series was the one that was completed first, because it makes more sense that they then added those sparkles for the Super Special rather than took them away for this. Which means they must have looked at the finished article in this and thought, do you know what, it's not right. And as much as we could just reproduce that like we reproduce the rest of the story, no, we are going to change it. That's brilliant. Brilliant that they cared that much. Speaking of Obi-Wan, when he first reappears to Luke, Luke says, "Why didn't you tell me about Darth Vader being his father?" And Obi-Wan says, "I was going to tell you when you completed your training, but you rushed off unprepared." Well, hold on, that sounds like he's describing The Empire Strikes Back. So he would have told him during The Empire Strikes Back. That would have spoiled Vader's big moment, wouldn't it? "Obi-Wan never told you what happened to your father. He told me enough. He said that you were my father." "Oh, yes. Well, good. I'm glad he told you. I can't stand secrets." We then get the whole a certain point of view discussion, albeit with some slightly different dialogue. But then, when Obi-Wan tells him about Leia, he says she was a twin, separated from Luke at birth, and brought secretly by Obi-Wan to foster parents on Alderaan. Geez, Obi-Wan, explain everything, why don't you? Some of us like a little bit of mystery. And then the issue finishes off with a few more pin-ups, including the Imperial Guards. So I didn't imagine them. At this, the halfway point, I'd like to take a little diversion and reminisce a bit about my childhood. No, don't skip ahead. I promise it'll be interesting. We've seen before how the British comic book tradition differs so wildly from the American. From the content to the frequency of release, it seems the two nations take a different approach in almost every way. That includes annuals. Marvel would usually release its annuals during the summer, giving fans an extra dose of their favourites. In the UK, annuals were released in time for Christmas, and they were hardbacks. The annual has always been a popular stocking filler, as children up and down the country awake on Christmas morning to find one of these rigid beauties at the foot of their bed. Why does that sound obscene? The contents could vary from a collection of your favourite funnies to a mixture of comic strip, text story and activity pages. It was in this format that I was first introduced to this adaptation of The Return of the Jedi. It featured all 4 issues gathered together, no adverts and, of course, a hardback cover. Now don't be too jealous, because although a hardback edition sounds great, in fine UK tradition, it was still done on the cheap. Can you see it? It's not me, is it? It's wonky, or at the very least, off-centre. So here we are, our fourth version of this adaptation. There's nothing new in it. It seems to use the Marvel Super Special as a template, as evidenced by Obi-Wan's appearance. And it lacks those extra pages from the series. Actually, it lacks the first page of story, that opening scene with Vader. I assume so that it would fit the page count better. So that's why I thought it began with C-3PO and R2-D2. I read this annual again and again as a kid, and I had no idea it started with anything other than the droids in the deserts of Tatooine. Anyway, there you go. Our lineup is complete. Let us continue our tale. So here we go, issue 3 and our extra bit of title page art. And you know what? It's only just occurred to me that there's a theme here, because in this issue it's an Ewok holding a spear. Issue 1 had Luke holding his lightsaber. Issue 2 had, I don't know, one of the absent Imperial Guards holding a short spear. And then issue 4 really goes for it by having 2 hands holding lightsabers. We are at the stage of the story now when the rebels have their big pre-Endor meeting. We find out that Lando has been promoted to general and that he's going to lead the attack on the Death Star. He says he is surprised that they didn't ask Han to do it, and Han retorts with, "Maybe they did, but I'm not crazy. You're the respectable one, remember?" That line has never made sense. Then we get some more colour craziness as we see the hologram of the Death Star. For once, the book doesn't do too bad a job, because the still pretty bizarre pink is the closest to the film's choice of red. After all the chit-chat is over, and Al Williamson has impressed us with his Admiral Akbar, our heroes hop into their stolen Imperial space shuttle, which is such a cool ship, and head off to the Forest Moon, including such familiar moments as Han telling Chewie to fly casual, and Vader allowing the shuttle through so he can deal with it himself. Before we get a nicely handled arrival on Endor. Now, I'm not going to keep on about the book and how the colouring techniques used in that really affect the quality overall of the storytelling. But here's a good example. At this point in the other versions, we get some sunlight slanting through behind our heroes. We can't see the tree canopy above them, but we know it's there because it's suggested to us by those rays. So what are we supposed to make of this? Bye-bye atmosphere, depth. And here's another question for you. How do you convey the speed of the speeder bike chase from the screen on the printed page? You can't really, can you? But I tell you what you can have, and that's 2 pages of interesting, action-packed pictures with lasers being fired and deflected and speeder bikes being blown up. Interestingly, we don't actually see Leia befriended by Wicket in this. We do see Chewbacca setting off the trap, and then Han and Luke's first encounter with the Ewoks. But after they are taken to the Ewok village, Leia just appears and tells us that she was befriended by an Ewok. It's whilst we're in the Ewok village that we get some of the best pages from the entire trilogy of adaptations. Yes, we get a good portrait of Mark Hamill, but it's the overall atmosphere, the way that shadows are used, half light. Yes, Al Williamson's renderings of the main characters, but also his mastery of things such as mist, that mean the atmosphere practically oozes from the page. Let's see how they handled that in the book. Oh my God! That is all then topped off by a nicely composed image showing the AT-AT arriving at the Imperial base, as Darth Vader once again comes face to face with his son. As in the film, Vader is handed Luke's weapon, and he comments on the fact that Luke has constructed his own lightsaber. Yeah, but not a red one. And no, the book doesn't redeem itself by correcting that error. Mind you, they could have been using the Return of the Jedi's own movie poster for reference, because in one of those, it is Luke that holds the red lightsaber, the one that was adapted from the original Revenge of the Jedi poster. Okay, so let's finish this with part 4 of the adaptation, which, as usual, begins with some great artwork. This time, it's Lando and Nine Numb that get the Williamson treatment. Back on the Forest Moon, one of the Ewoks has stolen a speeder bike by way of creating a distraction to draw some of the biker scouts away from the bunker. We are told here, by the way, that this is Wicket, but it isn't. It doesn't look like him, and it wasn't him in the film. Regardless, Han, Leia and the other rebels then infiltrate the bunker, and it's at this point that there was an additional scene filmed for the movie which kind of showed that there was more to the bunker than just walking through the door and stumbling across these operatives. But it was chosen, despite the relatively short length of each of these chapters, not to include that in this adaptation. It could have been interesting. As the rebels discover that the Imperials have known all along of their plans, and Admiral Akbar kind of cracks open his catchphrase, we discover that there was an extra element to the Emperor's plan. Yes, everything is unfolding as he has planned, as he has foreseen. However, just in case the rebels do manage to take down the shield generator, he has issued plans that the Death Star should then turn on the moon and destroy it. And he then says, as we are more familiar with, the Alliance will die, as will your friends. This is all too much for Luke, and the duel that we have all been waiting for begins, with the correct lightsaber colours. And it is all very well realised in this, the most emotional of all lightsaber duels. And I think this image really conveys that emotional weight of this battle. A lunging, stretching, swinging Luke Skywalker and a defensive Vader, still fighting but slowly conceding ground. Whilst elsewhere it is action, action, action. If you'd seen the film, I'm sure you loved it. If you didn't and you only had this, I'm sure you would love this. We've got a great panel here that is completely butchered by the book. Surely they could have done better than essentially printing the same picture twice. And then we move on to another well-known moment from the film. Now, in the adaptation of The Empire Strikes Back, they didn't reproduce the "I love you, I know" dialogue for perfectly valid reasons. However, in this adaptation, they also don't reproduce Leia's "I love you, I know" payoff. In fact, things get a bit mixed up here. R2 is taken out of the equation. And then as Han is trying to hotwire the door, a couple of stormtroopers approach. Leia shoots them, and although we can't see it in this image, they clearly got a shot in at Leia and hit her on the arm. And the closest we get to that famous bit of dialogue is Han saying, "Leia, you know I love you," and Leia saying, "Thanks for caring, General, but it's only my arm." Which means there is no secreted pistol either. However, Leia does point out that they have bigger problems, as they are confronted by the AT-ST. On the Death Star, Vader and Luke's duel comes to an end, and the Emperor is just as angry/triumphant as we are familiar with. I think the Force lightning is a little bit underwhelming on the page, but it is no less effective, especially effective in motivating Luke's father to save his son's life, hurling the Emperor down into the abyss. I'm not even going to show you how the book butchers that scene. Now we have elements of the AT-ST scene that are mixed up a bit, conflated, but in doing so, it actually makes more sense in this comic book than it did in the film. In the film, we see Han Solo wearing the AT-ST driver's helmet and speaking on the comlink to the people in the bunker. Immediately, the Imperials send out some troops as reinforcements, but as soon as they step out of the bunker, Han is there at the bunker entrance. How did that happen? Well, here it's different. Han's message is sent to the bunker, although it looks like we don't see him. Reinforcements are sent out to be confronted by numerous Ewoks, and we see the triumphant Chewbacca standing out at the top of the AT-ST. But we also see a speech bubble coming from within the AT-ST, and we are told that that is the voice of Solo. And he says, "No time for gloating, buddy. Let's get in there and blow that thing." Which they do. With the shield down, Lando has a much easier journey to the centre of the Death Star, easier than in the film. And as he makes his way back out off panel, we see Darth Vader's final moments. And here we have a couple of things of note. First of all, they change Vader's dying words. In the film, it's, "Tell your sister you were right, Luke. You were right." Here, with a similar tone, he says, "It's too late, Luke. It's too late." And the other thing is an example, again, of that desire to hold a couple of things back from the reader so that they could only be experienced in the film on the big screen. And that is the true face of Darth Vader. Specifically, Lucasfilm did not want it to be shown in the comic, and so it wasn't. It was kept hidden. As Vader is unmasked, we see not him, but a shocked Luke. Now, I get that they didn't want to show Anakin's face, but they could have shown Luke's. It looks like some kind of hairy-faced alien. Shortly after Darth Vader meets his end, so too does the Death Star. Back on Endor, celebrations begin. New friendships are formed, old ones are reaffirmed, fears are allayed, and Luke is reminded that he does have a family. And although we don't see the Force ghosts of Obi-Wan, Yoda and Anakin within this story, we do get to see them within this issue's bonus pin-ups, as Bill Sienkiewicz gives them the same treatment that other characters have had on the covers. And that last scene when they're back in the Ewok village, I can never read that without thinking of the music, without having it going through my head. You know what version of the music I'm talking about. With that, a saga, perhaps the greatest cinematic saga ever, drew to a close. Despite The Return of the Jedi being viewed as a weak film these days, we didn't think so back then. We all loved it. I saw it at the cinema, and apart from being freaked out by Bib Fortuna, I loved it. I didn't even mind the Ewoks. But with the story complete, it was only a matter of time before the commercial appeal of Star Wars wore off. Within 3 years of the film's release, not only had Kenner released the last of its classic toy line, but the long-running Star Wars comic book series also came to an end. For a few years, Star Wars became relatively forgotten, merely a nostalgic chapter for fans to look back on and relive courtesy of the magic of the videotape. But something that was so popular was never going to stay dead. And after a big revival of interest in the mid-90s, George Lucas announced that he was working on special editions of the original films, and then, most excitingly of all, brand new Star Wars movies. Since 1999, we've had a prequel trilogy, a sequel trilogy, and even a couple of anthology films. All of them have been accompanied by comic book adaptations. And, in case you're wondering, of course I couldn't resist.